Alright, I wanted to record some thoughts. Yesterday, I had an interesting insight on essentially like the nature of the self, or perhaps more so the nature of what I think human beings commonly, how they experience the self at its most fundamental and simple level. And I did this, sort of what I discovered was, it's all about, it's more my personal experience, my own self-inquiry, not so much with in concordance perhaps with like some kind of scientific method, or some more broad or socially considered way of conducting a study. But the way I look at things, I allow myself the freedom to speculate outside of any sort of framework that is existent. And that's I don't know, I think everyone should allow themselves the personal liberty to speculate outside of the parameters of whatever their religion or science says is correct, because it's sort of like breathing. We need to be able to breathe in order to feel free as human beings. And it doesn't, it's not necessarily about this ultimately discovering what is true in like some literal fashion, but under sort of something that feels true, that connects us to what we are. And it's sort of like the kind of insights that we have that connect us to who we are, that make us feel like it makes some kind of sense to us, where something clicks and it just feels like this must be the truth. And it doesn't have to be literally true in order for it to be a meaningful truth for that individual, but it also may not be transferable to others. Sort of like, this is, I guess, sort of the fundamental principle behind mystical insight. Is it's sort of a deeply personal experience that may not have any thing that would be recognizable to somebody else beyond that individual's experience. But so what I was looking at, and what I've contemplated for a very long time, is what is the self, and where is it, and is there a self? And what I came out with was this: yes, there is something in me that seems to be at the heart of what I consider myself. And what I think this self is essentially the experience that I remember of the feeling of love between me and my mother, and the feeling, these early childhood feelings of being surrounded by sort of a golden glow and warmth and love. And then that is sort of at the heart of who I am and how I function. And that itself is like it's a very, it's a positive feeling. And when I think of who I am, this is what appears to lie at the heart of this I amness, is this emotional memory of a very profoundly positive experience early in childhood. And so that's sort of, I think, part of what motivates my actions as a person, is to serve this sense of self, to reinforce this sense of self, to protect this sense of self, and to convey this feeling of self to others, because I believe that that might be part of the ego's way, essentially, of wanting to replicate itself. It's like the life force inside of me wanting to replicate an experience that I have linked with a positive association to who I am at the most simple and fundamental level. So it's like a positive experience that lives inside of me that I want to surround myself with, create more of, and influence other people to experience a similar sort of feeling of love and this golden sort of glow of light that I felt when I was first came into this world. And so, that is what I saw when I thought about what is it, who is this person that I am, and what is like the most basic component of who he is. Now, what's interesting about this is it's like an emotional photograph of an experience. So it's not necessarily direct experience. So it's not like every time I think of self, I think of like I'm suddenly filled with this re-experience of what I've experienced when I was an infant. But I get some whiff of that. Like I get a good sense of what that experience was. And, there's a certain pleasant fondness for this sensation, and that like ultimate goodness somehow exists within that experience from back then. And so, it's like when I have experiences that are all, it's sort of like every experience that I've had subsequent to that experience is now weighed against this initial experience of where I felt the inception of my sense of self came into reality. And so, on the surface, it's a very positive experience. But it's also an experience that is used to now it also serves as a contrast to experience that feel like non-self. So like the more non-self an experience feels, the more alien I feel, the more strange I feel, the more unpleasant I feel, the more I feel like my sense of self is in jeopardy. And so what I believe, as humans, what we do is we all have some initial experience in our infancy that determines how we view ourself, what that self looks like. And so what you notice here is that the self is associated with something that was once a real experience, but now exists as a photograph. So, if you look at it, take a step back and look at it this way, you have to ask yourself, well, how can my self be a real self if it's a photograph of an emotion that no longer is exactly present, but is only a sort of background feeling that is now stands in contrast and is used to determine like what is to move me in my life experience closer to re-experiencing that experience, even though I can never really fully re-experience that exact experience. It's like myself wants to seek out experiences that are similar. And so, the photograph, could it be said, that the self exists beyond the photograph? Like what is it that exists beyond the photograph? What if the self is somewhere closer to a non-decision, where a non-decision had been made about what the self is? Something that is beyond that initial photograph. Something where there was just a state of being where there were no photographs taken, because there was no desire to take a photograph of the past, of what would become the past, because there was no fear that there would be a difference between the present and the future. So, when there's just a state of being, there's no need for a memory to be made, because there's no fear, essentially. There's no fear of like having to preserve something. But it seems like when we're in an infant state, we begin to have turbulence within that state of being, and beingness seems to begin to differentiate itself, because we have this, I had this powerful sense, sort of golden feeling of love, and then I had different experiences that seem to stand in contrast to that. But it seems like what the ego is afraid of is, once it determines what is symbolic, what symbolically represents the self, it, more than death itself, it fears its own death within the death of the image of that self. So for me, the fear of losing that memory, that emotional, very positive experience as an infant, would feel like I believe would trigger the fear of death, like greater than an actual death, because the ego doesn't really understand what death is. The ego does not fear the death of the body. The ego fears the death of self, and the fear of, and the self that it fears of dying is like this emotional snapshot that we take early on in our childhood. So what we do is we seek to preserve that sense of self that comes from a snapshot, but not necessarily the reality of who we are, but some experience that is possible within the human nervous system. And so when we look at what motivates us in this life, I think more so than any sort of particular activity that we happen to be involved in that may appear to serve a certain purpose, ultimately, I think everything we do from an ego-based decision comes from some allegiance to this early photograph that we take as infants of what the self means to us. And so, like, my fundamental sense of self is like a warm, positive feeling. But, you know, what I've noticed in other people is, in some people, they have fear and paranoia seems to be their primary mode of operation. And so, you know, it's like when you have thieves and murderers who do these things against other people, I think their fundamental motivation is the same as, you know, somebody who has a positive sense of self. Because the act that they're doing is reinforcing that sense of self, which happens to be, in their case, probably something very dark early in their infancy. So like a sense of darkness, despair, fear, some black hole of, you know, of horror is their sense of self. So they're when they think of like what is, if they like really strip themselves down completely naked and try to take everything away of what is like the most fundamental feeling that exists within themselves that they have associated to who they are, my guess would be that it would be some profoundly negative experience early on in their infancy that was the determining factor of what type of self they would try to preserve. So, you know, on the surface, someone who does things that are against others, you would think, oh, they're doing it for personal gain. They're doing it to get power over other people. They're doing it to steal resources. But when you look at, here's some interesting synchronicity. A black snake in the grass when I'm talking about. What they're doing is they're, you know, on the surface they're like stealing to gain resources, to get, you know, money, sex, power through doing lying, cheating, and betraying others. But that's like on the surface of what it looks like they're gaining something. But the true thing that they're gaining is you can see in how they live, like how they, like someone who's like always nervous and afraid and smarmy, and you know this person is a grifter. You know, on the surface you could say, well, he's gaining things by, you know, lying and cheating to others. But what he's really getting is a reason to feel the negative feelings that he does. So the real reward is not, you know, in the acts or in the acquisition of material in this world. It's the reinforcement of that. My fundamental self is paranoia and fear, and so I have to do things in myself to make myself afraid and paranoid that people are against me and that people are out to take something from me and that they want my life, you know, and they hang me if they catch me. So in order to maintain this sense of self, this fearful sense of self, it's like that person sort of has this compulsion to do things in the world that reinforce that negative, what we've associated with a negative state of being. But to them, their ego's survival depends on it. The same way our ego's survival depends on us reinforcing, you know, a positive self-image. And I think so. This is like where I think fundamental motivating forces come from in human beings, is this emotional snapshot that we take early on, and that our ego then identifies as, this is what I feel most closely related to, this is what is familiar to me, this is what's comfortable to me, and this is the type of feeling that I'm going to reinforce with the behaviors that I'm going to choose. So the behaviors sort of are chosen from the sense of self that we have. So, you know, the question is how can we, if we want to change our behaviors, perhaps what we need to do is to go to what our fundamental sense of self is and how that, you know, begin to observe it. And in the observance of it, you know, that's where we can begin to see, you know, I see some movements in this. I see that this sense of self is not quite as concrete as I thought it was. And so it's kind of like you're taking, if you want to start to really change your behaviors, perhaps what you need to do in a metaphorical sense is take like a caveman that has been encased in ice and then, you know, thaw him out so that he can become alive again. And so, you know, perhaps to change our behaviors, what we need to do is to allow to become very present with what our sense of self is, and then allow our sense of self to become unfrozen and begin to start wiggling its little toes again and moving its tentacles again, and realizing that it's not trapped within an image, positive or negative. Because, you know, whether it's positive or negative, it's always going to be force your hand in your decisions if you don't recognize the source of your actions. And if you have a stiff, non-living self from the past determining your actions now, your life will be more hollow and robotic, and there will be a great deal of dissatisfaction, because nothing in this world will ever be that same experience again. So your sense of self will only ever stand as a contrast to what your current experience of reality is. And so you'll always be disappointed, because you can't actually re-experience the same feeling twice. So it's a bit like chasing the dragon, like someone who did heroin. They can only, they're always trying to, do heroin again so that they can re-experience the first time that they did heroin, but they can never really ever hope to achieve that, because that's an experience that you have only once. And so by becoming more aware that what the self is and how we perceive the self, then we become we begin to gain more agency over who we are. Because if we just try to manually change our choices and behave differently, we're always going to, until we identify the self that is motivating our actions, we're always going to be fighting against that invisible force. Because if we're not looking at it, it's going to be moving our hands from behind the curtain. But if we begin to look behind the curtain to see what is moving our hands, then we can begin to influence that thing that is behind the curtain. And it's through this less, it's actually, you could say it's less direct, but it's actually more direct, because you're going to the source of your own life force. And you're reclaiming your own life force as a malleable, ever-changing thing that is always in constant flux and constant motion. And it's through subtle intention that we can, subtle and sustained attention, that we have the most power over our own outcomes and our own actions and our life experience. Anyhow, so these were some thoughts that I wanted to share and record for the logs of my personal insights, and just things of where I'm discussing my worldview and documenting it. Anyhow, so you guys have a good one.